Good evening, everybody. Okay, thought we would start with introductions. My name is Janet Love. I am a co-moderator of the Racial Equity Council here at Fourth.
And I'm Joe Morrow, Associate Pastor for Evangelism and Community Engagement here at Fourth.
I'm Cynthia Joho, and I just realized I left all my notes at home.
I'm Maggie McGuire, and I am a former member of the Racial Equity Council here at Fourth.
My name's Deborah Ramsey, and I am a member of the Racial Equity Council as well.
Okay, we thought we would start by just giving you a feel for sort of how it was for us going into the trip. This trip, this pilgrimage was hosted by Trinity UCC Church, led by the famous Otis Moss III, who I'm sure all know and heard of and love and respect, and Freedom Road, who is headed by Lisa Sharon Harper, who is a scholar. She's a civil rights activist. She has a very popular podcast. She is an author. Her group does trainings, anti-racism trainings, and the intent of this pilgrimage was to bridge the gap between what we were all told, what we all were taught, and what happened with the enslaved people in our country. It was also to help us discover anew the soul power of these African people and their talent and their genius and their contributions to America. Lisa Harper's really big on stories, so there was a huge emphasis on stories on this trip. Stories of the enslaved people, stories of the attendees with each other. There were about 200 participants on this trip. About 20 of us were not Black. The majority of our attendees came from Trinity, but the attendees as a whole came from all over the country, and some people came because they saw Lisa Sharon Harper talk about it on her podcast, and they wanted to come. So they came from all over the country, people from California, people from the Northeast, people from the Midwest. It was really quite a diversity of people. This group of 200 people, we were needing to travel from place to place. They got 4 coach buses, and there were 50 people assigned to each bus. And the buses were given names that were significant in the African American history, like Denmark Vesey, who I think we're going to hear about more later. He was an enslaved man who purchased his own freedom through money that he won through gambling. The Mother Emanuel Church, we had a Mother Emanuel bus named after the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. There was the Esau and Janie B. Jenkins bus, named after a pastor and his wife, who were civil rights activists who spent their money buying buses to transport children from the Sea Islands to Charleston to get to school, and also workers to get to work, and also emphasis on training the workers in learning to pass their literacy tests so that they could vote. There's a bus named after Queen Quet, who is the current leader of the Gullah Geechee people who still live in the Sea Islands. Her name is Marquetta Goodwine, and she is now advocating for the Sea Islands people. So those were our buses. Each bus had its own logistics coordinator, had its own storyteller, and they also had people who were professionally trained to help us as we learned these very emotionally impactful stories. And we visited these very emotionally impactful sites. There was a coping and resilience coordinator and a spiritual formation coordinator. There was a lot of emphasis on spirituality and scripture on this trip. We started with a dinner and a session where we were led in spiritual scripture and stories by a reverend from South Africa. And we had special people pretty much throughout helping us, leading us in trying to process what we saw, what we observed, and what we heard at our various locations. There was a lot of preparation, as you can imagine. There were 3 big Zoom calls. One was logistics, but 2 were for your bus group. And those calls were really focused on how do we treat each other on our bus? How do we, so we were on one call, I don't know about you guys, but in one of my calls for our bus, we were each asked to pick a safe name, a safe word. So my safe word was understanding, and others were things like faithfulness, truthfulness, kindness. And we talked about how we would treat each other and respect each other as we went through our journeys with our buses. We talked about our beloved community, the things that pull us away from being a beloved community, and the things that pull us together as a beloved community. One more thing, 2 more things actually. We were given a curriculum of suggested pre-reading and pre-viewing, which was very, very helpful. If you had time to do any of that in advance, it was very great foundation for the things that we learned on our trip. One of the pre-reading suggestions was the book that Lisa Sharon Harper wrote called Fortune, How Race Broke My Family, and the rest of it was like, how do we fix it, something like that. It's an extremely unique and interesting book because it started by her researching her own family's history. And she found out so many amazing things. She made it into a book. So it has that sort of unique bent to it that is really interesting to read. And just one more thing about the trip. We were asked to never post on social media the locations that we were visiting until the day after we visited those locations. And it was a shame, but it was for our own safety, and we were reminded of that every day. They said, please do not post our locations. It's for our safety. The other thing they did that was frustrating to me until I understood why was that they never included the location of our hotel in our emails. We got a ton of emails, and there was never, I was looking, where is our hotel? We had to wait until we received our hard copy packets in order to get the address of the hotel. But again, that was for our own safety. They did not want the location of our hotel floating around electronically in anybody's email. So that was actually not the best uplifting note to end this introduction on, but I'm gonna hand this over to Joe, and he's gonna walk us through our various things that we visited, places that we visited.
Thank you, Janet. So I'm gonna walk us through some of the sites that we saw, some of the activities that we engaged in along the way. So some highlights. Each day focused in on a couple of different key sites, and along the way we really sort of traced the history, if you will, the journey of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic and throughout the world of British North America, particularly in the American South. So we started at downtown Charleston at the Battery and the waterfront. So these are historic sites in Charleston through which slaves were transported. So We saw where enslaved Africans were brought to shore, where they were essentially processed like livestock, and then sent off to various plantations, which were essentially work camps. We also got to see, I believe on that same day, and you all correct me if I'm wrong, so I'm going to let my colleagues here from the trip and fellow pilgrims fill in any blanks that I may have. So we also went to Mother Emanuel, AME Church. Raise your hand if you've heard of Mother Emanuel. So Mother Emanuel has a at least 150 some year history. And unfortunately, in the last 10 years or so, it's become known for one day in that 150 some year history. Day when 9 of the members of the Charleston, of the Mother Emanuel Church were murdered, gunned down in their own church. In some ways, in an evening just like this. So, we don't take it for granted, or at least I hope we don't, that we can gather in this space, even on this evening, in relative safety, and that we had 9 of our siblings in Christ on an evening just like this one, whose safety was essentially taken away from them. So something to keep in mind, and also really a rejoinder to what Janet had mentioned earlier about all of the various safety precautions that we had to take as a group, because if you can imagine 200 people who are majority African American going to these sites around Charleston, knowing what we know about recent history in Charleston, not 150, 200 year history that we spent many days exploring, but recent history in Charleston, we had to be aware that our safety was not guaranteed. So something to pause and think about as we walk through the highlights of this trip. So we went to visit Mother Emanuel, and I know others will share their reflections perhaps on the gravity of that visit. Knowing that we just looked down the staircase to where the fellowship hall was, where they had gathered for Bible study that night, and for many was the last night of their lives. Then we went to the International African American Museum. This is a museum that's not open yet, but we got a sneak preview of the museum, particularly its outdoor spaces. And it is on the waterfront and really designed to essentially be a ship. Did I get that right? Like a ship that essentially comes out of the water and represents the boatloads of African Americans of enslaved Africans who had made their way to the shore. The museum will be a resource for not only understanding African American history in the transatlantic context, but also a place for genealogy, for genealogical research for black families to be able to look at historic records and to trace the journeys of their ancestors.
Joe, I'd love just to make a comment on that. The architect, this museum sits up almost on stilts, and it's right on the ocean. And the reason he did that, because this was really sacred land where the Africans came over to. So it was a boat, but it was really to keep this land sacred from ocean to earth. And he wanted to make sure that was represented. So the museum sits up. It does not sit on the land.
Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. And we'll actually let you see what it looks like as the museum is sort of raised up in a photo in just a moment. In addition to the museum, we also went on a different day to visit the Boone Plantation. And this plantation is one of the many, of course, you will find in the Charleston area and throughout South Carolina. And one of the reasons why our guides wanted to take us there is not only to, of course, see where many enslaved Africans spent their lives and toiled away in what were essentially work camps, not unlike, for any of you who have seen this most recent series by Ken Burns on the U.S. and the Holocaust. It's a reminder to me, and actually it was one of the first images that came to mind, that these were essentially work camps, not unlike those that you would see in Auschwitz, for instance. And our guides wanted us to see not only the plantation, of course, but how it is represented today. And, we're in fall festival season, where you go and maybe go to an apple orchard, pick apples, and, have apple cider and apple cider donuts and hay rides. And the Boone Plantation kind of felt like that, at least in the way that the owners were trying to represent it. So our guides wanted us to see the difference between what a place represents historically and how contemporary people, current day people, are wrestling with that heritage and uncomfortable with that heritage. And so trying to maybe paint a different gloss over that heritage. So the Boone Plantation, as well as a presentation we were given there by a member of the Gullah community, was really a central experience. Then we had an opportunity to actually drive by the site of what's called the Stono Rebellion. Has anybody heard of the Stono Rebellion? Okay, got a couple of history buffs out here. Stono Rebellion happened in 1739 and was one of the largest slave rebellions in what is now the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about it later through my own reflection. And we saw the site of the Stono Rebellion on the way to the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, where we were immersed in the world of the Gullah Geechee community. So these were enslaved Africans who had made their way to a kind of provisional freedom on islands off the coast of South Carolina that would have been otherwise inaccessible to those who would have tried to run after them and re-enslave them. So a provisional kind of freedom through which they preserved many attributes of the West African cultures from which they came. Anything else that we went and saw that I did not capture up here? These were just a few highlights. And I'll just briefly make note of the photos, and we can come back to these. So if any of you among my colleagues here have a photo that you want us to really center our attention on as you present, just let me know. This is at the Battery, right on the waterfront in Charleston, which was the site of slave markets, slave auctions here. Just another marker for where enslaved Africans were essentially processed. Again, more from the waterfront and the stories that we were told about individuals whose lives and families had been impacted by the things that took place on these sites. Denmark Vesey, who Janet had mentioned earlier, also a major player in the sites around downtown Charleston, having not only bought his freedom through a lottery, but essentially started a uprising which he hoped would result in the freedom of other enslaved Africans. A uprising that was essentially biblical and theological in its origins and its nature. VC, although he was captured, put on trial, executed among with the other members of the uprising, was, as is written here, a source of inspiration for other anti-slavery figures in generations to come. That's Mother Emanuel AME Church, and we had an opportunity to hear from the current pastor, right? And also, I think he had a role. I think he's maybe had a role as a public official at some point. I think that's a very significant cross in the church of those who perished in the attack, including the senior pastor. The African American Museum, the International African American Museum, is, as Cynthia mentioned, it's raised up on pillars. This is Curtis Inabinet, and I'll talk about him in just a second. Someone I really enjoyed meeting, and we met him by chance, and he's a bit of a local hero in the Charleston area. This is our concluding ceremony on the beach at St. Helena Island with Reverend Moss leading us in prayer and reflection. And that's our group. And these were some of those reflection circles that Janet had mentioned, where we did reflection every day throughout our gathering. And so this is a photo of us around our various tables. Mostly those tables were with those who shared our bus, but sometimes not, right? I believe we mixed it up a little bit. So we got to experience what folks from different buses and a cross-section of the community got to experience on the pilgrimage as well. All right, so I will share just my brief reflection, and then I'll hand it off for another one of my pilgrim colleagues to share. So I wanted to go back to this photo here, Curtis Inabinet. But let me tell you how we met him. So we're on our way to the Penn Center, and we had already been late this day. I think it was maybe day 4 or 3, like the tail end of our trip. So there's only, I think this might have been the last full day. And we had already started late, so we were afraid that we were going to be behind schedule in visiting the Gullah Geechee community on St. Helena Island. And it's about a 2-hour drive or so from where we were staying. So it just so happened that we passed the site of the Stono Rebellion, and there's a road marker for it. And we had passed it, and then the air conditioning in one of our buses, the bus that I happened to be on, went out. And so we had to pull over at a gas station about half a mile from the site where the road marker is for the Stono Rebellion. And we sat tight thinking, the driver will get out, look at it, switch some wires, and then we'll be back on the road. Well, 20 minutes turned into about at least 2 to 3 hours of waiting at the gas station. And you can imagine your spirits are a little low and you feel a little deflated. But it was also eye-opening, right? Because, for me, I started thinking, you're in a rural location in the South with a bus that's broken down. You don't know anybody. If we were transported back in time to maybe 50 years ago. It would have been more of a traumatic situation back then than it is now, because you had no idea who you would encounter, how hostile they may be to you, especially if you're, a busload of, 40-some African Americans along with your white and Asian American colleagues stranded on a rural road. So it was a little bit of a window into what this kind of travel might have felt like just 50 years ago, right, or 40 years ago. And so we're sitting in the gas station trying to eat some lunch, trying to pass the time and talk to each other. And in drives this gentleman who is about a little over 90 years young. And he's driving along, trying to get some gas, and then looks at us and says, what is this group? I mean, he's from this area, and so said, I don't really see busloads of 50 people roll through this gas station very often. So he was really curious as to who we were. And we told him about the 1619 pilgrimage, that we're from this group largely from Chicago, and that we had come down to South Carolina to really understand the journey of African Americans, to center the experience of black people in the South. And he began to tell stories, and the stories Mr. Inabinet has to tell. I will just tell you one. So Mr. Inabinet was a Korean War vet who had returned from the Korean War, come back to the States, come back to South Carolina, and began essentially a life as a farmer, and had been working for about a decade or so with other farmers in the the Gullah Geechee Island area, and was interested in finding new places where those on the Sea Islands, who were primarily black farmers, could find new markets, could find places to sell their produce. So happened to find a place that he liked, and knew that, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s, knew that he couldn't just buy it as a collective of black farmers, because the land was owned by whites, and whites who would probably look askance at trying to sell their property to black farmers. So he had to use essentially a white go-between, a white buyer who was going to buy on behalf of the black farmers. So found someone, they struck a deal, and they were going to sign contracts to, sign off the land. Well, Curtis and the farmers had to actually be present to do the signing. And it's when they showed up to do the signing that those who had owned the land, the white owners of the land, said, no, not going to do this. And of course, they couldn't back out because it's a legal transaction, and legally there was no way for them to back out. So they reluctantly signed, and then it came the day when Curtis and the other black farmers had to actually take possession of the land, get whatever keys they needed for the gates to get in. And they found that those who were present didn't want to let them in, and found out through kind of the rumor mill that the reason why there was so much resistance for them to have this land is because the Klan met on that land and didn't want to easily give it up. So here's Curtis facing off against essentially Klan members who didn't want to let go of this land. And he said, it was probably, he was more nervous and felt more threatened than at any other time in his life, because he didn't know what would happen. It was a standoff, and he didn't know if, they let go of the land, and the next day these folks come back and torch it, right? Or come back and kidnap him. So there was some kerfuffle and some conversation, and ended up that these Klan members backed off and went away. So they got possession of the land, and they found a shed, started clearing out this shed, and realized that underneath, kind of on the ground, they had hit some kind of structure. So started digging and realized that they had found some kind of cellar. And in the cellar, there were artifacts from the early 1700s. And it just so happened that they realized, with the help of some archaeologists, that they had found the site of the beginning of the Stono Rebellion. So what had happened was that the enslaved Africans who decided they wanted to rebel had taken over this, essentially a storehouse, had gotten guns, ammunition, supplies, and this was the storehouse. This was the place that they had gotten those supplies from. So there was a reason why the Klan, essentially, from his mind, wanted to cover it up, because they wanted to bury this history. They wanted to bury the history of black liberation, the history of a black uprising, and keep it underground so that no one could see it. So once they realized what they had discovered, they not only, of course, used this space as a market, but in subsequent decades have tried to hold on to it and essentially create a state park or a local park on that land. So that's the reason why there's a marker. He's the reason why there's a Stono Rebellion marker. He's the reason why that the site of the beginning of the Stono Rebellion is hopefully going to become a state park. So just quite a figure to have in our midst. And that's just the beginning of his journey. He became the mayor of a suburb of Charleston, the city of Ravenel. He helped to provide necessary state funding for the public school system in Ravenel because of some of the atrocious conditions that the schools had been in. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s. And I can tell you more about that later. But Curtis was just an inspiration for me, and really someone who I felt a kinship with. And for me, just really, in some ways solidified this trip being a cultural pilgrimage for me. I've gotten some funds through a fellowship that I'm a part of to create any project of that would further my own sense of leadership. And I decided to make the project about pilgrimage and the importance of pilgrimage in this post-pandemic-ish landscape that we're in right now. Thinking about the traumas of these last couple of years, not just COVID traumas, but also racial traumas, right? And political traumas. And so once I found out about this trip, I immediately wanted to go. It just felt right in place with this larger theme of pilgrimage that I've been exploring in this season. And for me, the conversation with Curtis was a pilgrimage to my own cultural past, and a way that I could understand the importance of keeping kinship with my own people from a cultural perspective. And it's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to engage with members of the Black church and in a Black church environment. And so this was a pleasant surprise. It felt very much like a family reunion, and opportunities to meet with individuals like Curtis felt like an extension of that family reunion. But it also felt like an opportunity to recover history and to recover what is most meaningful and most valuable and precious from our past, our collective past. And that story keeps ringing home with me. A group of people that want to bury history, and then a group of people who want to recover it. And so I think it's a great metaphor for what we're trying to do with a pilgrimage like this one. And want to pass it off to, who's next? Deb.
Well, I kind of focused on, when I was trying to get my thoughts together, I was really kind of focused on, I'm not a person that picks up on the facts so much as just kind of get the gist of information. And I base my experiences on, I remember my experiences by how they make me feel. And so this experience to me, I started a couple years ago. I did go on the DC trip, we called it the Tour of Oppression, or Oppression Tour in Washington, DC, and that kind of was my first exposure of the Museum of African American History and Culture. And really, we spent 2 days there, and it was just, I learned so much history. To give you a little background of mine, my mom and dad were born and raised in a town in western North Carolina. I grew up, I was socialized in a by very romanticized depiction of the South and their role in the Civil War and antebellum South. And so I grew up believing all that, and I generally had blinders on as far as the plights of other people. And so, and my basic history was just tainted by that, my knowledge of U.S. history. So it has just been as an adult these last years and going on, starting again in the DC trip. And then I went on the Civil Rights Tour with this church in 2019. And again, it opened my eyes to even more, and I've just learned things that I just had no idea about. But this one was different in the sense of we were really amongst people that this is their heritage and their ancestry. And there were just days that the pain was so palpable. And there were days that it was very difficult to even make eye contact. Them to us, because they were, I don't want to speak for any, I'm assuming that they were dealing with their emotion towards whites. We are learning and seeing places where human beings were treated as as just nothing more than commodities and cattle, as animals. And you could just see the processing happening in their, they have very real family and ancestral stories that I don't have. But I'm looking at from a white person's point of view. And I can tell you that when we were at Boone Plantation, and we're seeing and we're hearing by the docents the romanticized version of this, and you're standing with, again, 90% of our whole group were African Americans, and you're listening to this, and this is words that I grew up and believed. My mother would tell us stories. They were taken out of school every year, all of them, to go see Gone with the Wind. I grew up romanticizing movies like Gone with the Wind. So I had always heard those versions, and so now I can see, I'm a little more educated. So I spent that afternoon saying, who would I be? Who am I? If I was back in this time, who would I have been? It was largely the women that were in charge of who got bought, who got sold, who didn't treat families as families. They were just commodities, and and I just thought, would I have been that person? It was very difficult to process from my, that was kind of where I could come in and relate to that day. And when they showed us the slave quarters, and it was a one room with one window, and we've just learned about the lives and the treatment, and you're just, I would stand in there with just tears and say, how did these people get up every day? And I would look out that window and is that where they found their hope? They're just such a spiritual people. And I just thought, do they see God out this window, and is that how they can go on? And we spent a very long day. And again, we passed our bus mates and all the people that were on this pilgrimage. And you almost just couldn't look at each other. Some were in tears. There were people hugging and crying, and you're just like, oh, it was. So this was valuable in ways I couldn't possibly articulate. And I'm not done processing this, and I've got a very long road ahead of learning and of reconciling my complicity and understanding systemic racism, understanding the extent of oppression of marginalized groups. And so this was just part of it, but that's what I took away. And I came away just saying, these people are so beautiful. The spirit, the resilience, the resourcefulness. It's just, but the spirituality. Now I hear the music in a different way. Now I see the people in a different way. I walk in Chicago and I see people that I didn't notice before. I mean, this didn't just happen after this trip, but it's really culminating in where I see art in a different way. Because now you can see the pain that it came from. It's not just seeing wrinkles on a person's face or gray hairs in their head. It's their ancestry. It's the generations of pain and trauma and resourcefulness and hope and faith and beauty. So, yeah, I am forever changed.
One of the first things I did when I heard about the 1619 pilgrimage with Trinity was to Google difference between trip and pilgrimage. And with pilgrimages, I learned that things slow down. There's time for processing. And years ago, pilgrimages were on foot, so people walked long, long distances. And pilgrimages, unlike trips, or unlike some trips, change the traveler. That's the one that resonated with me the most. This pilgrimage was about history, Black history told through the eyes of Black people. That's not the history that I grew up with. The history I grew up with was told through the eyes of white people. In the 50s and the 60s, when I was little, much of the history that I learned, if not all of it, omitted the contributions of people of color. It also omitted the oppression and the brutality of whites. I said yes to the pilgrimage because I wanted to correct the record. I wanted to supplement it with the real facts and experience a fuller, more truthful sense of how we got to where we are today. As you've heard from the others, the way we got from the hotel to the various sites was by a chartered bus, and each of the buses was named after an African American. We rode the same one every day to promote community, and I was assigned to the Esau and Janie B. Jenkins bus. Those were new names to me, so I Googled. And I learned that Esau and Janie B. Jenkins lived on St. John's Island and had a 1966 VW station wagon. In the 1940s, they began busing children to school and adults to work from St. John's Island to the Charleston Peninsula. They provided the transportation for free and asked only that the people who were being transported vote. They were activists, resourceful leaders whose names never made it into the history books read by white children. 3 years ago, however, that Volkswagen was at a Cars at the Capitol pop-up exhibit between the National Gallery of Art and the National Air and Space Museum. I began to ask myself, what if Esau and Janie B. Jenkins' story and the thousands of other untold stories made their way into the curriculums of schools, where both white children and black children would learn this history? So that's important because stories shape perceptions. Stories need to be heard so that the truth is known. Another truth that the pilgrimage brought home to me was the long-lasting effect of trauma. We saw the wharves where the slaves were sold, auctioned really. Children, preschoolers, were separated from their families. The family unit was demolished. I was curious, is trauma inheritable? So I Googled. Turns out it is. The response to violence alters the DNA, which is then passed along through the genes to subsequent generations. That has implications for me today because I live in a society with descendants of people who suffered profound wrongs through no fault of their own. Today, the violence continues as racism. What this pilgrimage did for me was to reinforce my desire to work against racism and to learn more about racism, especially the structural piece of racism. Before trainings, I thought that racism and personal prejudice was the same thing, but it's not. I've learned through trainings that there's a structural component to racism that's found in our laws and our policies and practices, and that's the place where I want to do my work, even though the progress is incremental and takes place years after I'll be gone. It's still worthwhile work, I think.
So this was the T-shirt that we were given to wear. On the front is the Sankofa bird. I believe it's from Ghana. That's what I have in my notes. Its head is turned back and feet forward. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. This was the symbol for our trip. This was on our altar table that we had in the room where we had breakfast. And on the back of this T-shirt, it says, "We cannot make up for all the lives lost and dreams snatched, for all the suffering endured, but we can atone for it. We can acknowledge the crime, and we can do something to try to set things right, to ease the hardship and hurt of so many of our fellow Americans." And this is a quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project. So, as I said, I left all my notes at home. I hope I don't take Route 66 out to California. I think that this bird is important for African Americans, but also for us, that we can also turn back, acknowledge. We can't right the wrong, but we certainly can acknowledge what's been done. I thought that it was interesting to go back for what was sent to us when we signed up. This was for the people of African descent. The intention and purpose of this pilgrimage is to immerse ourselves, our story, to bridge the gap between the narratives we've been told and what happened, to understand our soul power and genius anew, and learn from our ancestors what we need for the journey ahead. For us, those not of African descent, the intention and purpose of this pilgrimage is to immerse yourself in the story of the other, to bridge the gap between what you were taught and told and what happened, to come to a deeper understanding of and appreciation for African American contributions to American democracy. So, when I started writing my notes, I came to this. I had also gone on the civil rights mission trip that Vicki Curtis and Robert Crouch organized with Jerry and Karen, Deborah and Maggie. I had done the CROAR training. That was kind of a little base work for me. The civil rights trip really then pushed me forward. I started connecting the dots. Things that were separate in the history now started to form a thread up to where we are now. So after hearing about 1619 and then this pilgrimage, I thought this would be another learning trip. As we said, it was much more than a learning trip. This was an emotional trip. This was time for us to sit back and observe and listen instead of being the leaders. And I will tell you, in this group, there was no place for us to be leaders. These were fabulous people strongly marching on. One of the most emotional times for me was when we were at the market, when we were at the museum looking out over the ocean. I could really feel our fellow brothers and sisters, African Americans, many who had ancestors that had left the shore across the ocean, the door to the unknown, to come across in ships where they were going to be sold as slaves, to Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, where we heard that they were held out on an island and then dispatched for sale. Many who passed away while waiting were dumped in the water. The mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, was distraught. He was disgusted, not by the death, because of the stench. We learned at the same time that there was a container of 700 human beings that died in the cold because nobody came to rescue them. I thought so often that this history that I learned of our country, our colony, we were colonized by Christians, people holding the Bible, talking about everybody being born in the image of God. Yet we allowed ourselves to dehumanize other humans to grow our pocketbooks. And that really is what keeps me totally immersed in this. The other piece is the segregation that has happened in our country that I feel, I regret that I have not been able to enjoy the deep culture of these African Americans. The joy they have, the professionalism, the want of education, the food and music that we certainly have appropriated, but have not been willing to still be side by side and celebrate and thank. The accumulated trauma is certainly something that sticks with me. You know, we can think how terrible this has been, but we know that every individual now has this accumulated trauma that we really have to be aware of. One of the other things that I love that I wrote down was that there was such there were so many cultures, right, coming over from Africa. I mean, there wasn't just one, you know, little town, one country. There were many. So there were many languages. There was a lot of different food. There was a lot of different music. They incorporated all of it, and that became their secret. That secret was their resistance. And I thought that that was so beautiful.
I loved hearing all of your thoughts. I just thought they were so wonderful. I don't think I have anything profound to say about what I brought away from the trip. I will tell you what I want all of us, all of you, to take away from tonight, and that is my hope, is that you will take away a strong desire to learn more about the real history of the enslaved Africans in our country, and not just how it was for them, not just what really happened, the stark truth of it, but what happened after the Civil War, what happened with the hope of Reconstruction, which I think would have been just the dawning of a great new day in this country. But it failed, terribly, terribly failed, through the sheer will of the fear and the hate by the mostly white Southerners, but also Northerners, because the economy of this country, after so many years of slavery, was built on slavery. Their factories in the North were supplied with the cotton and the other raw materials that were produced by the slaves in the South. They were exploited, treated, as we have seen, like chattel. It was chattel slavery. They were assets. There were a few things that struck me on the trip that I didn't know before. There was a period of time after which the importation of Africans into this country was banned. No more shipping from Africa. So what did the slave owners do? They produced their own slaves through forced impregnation of their female slaves. And they needed to change the laws, because the law at the time would have been that the child takes the status of the father, could not have that. So the law was changed so the children would take the status of their mothers, so that the slave owners, they never really suffered for the want of the spread of their assets. They had a lot of assets. The slave trade continued to flourish after that. And I was just amazed by that fact alone. I was amazed by the fact that as I sat at one of our discussion tables, my fellow table mates were talking about how their families were so particular about tracing their family trees to be as complete as possible, because their parents did not want them going out and falling in love and marrying a blood relative. There were so many slaves who were sold off, and there was no way to know where you would where you would run into a blood relative. And it hit me like a ton of bricks, how we live lives that, and I'm not white, but I still have lived a life where I never had to think about any of these things. I never had to think about my daughter's safety if she got stopped by a police officer. I worry about her safety now after the shootings in Atlanta of the Asian women who were just shot down. And that was my first taste of, that's really what it feels like to feel that fear. That's really something I knew in my head, but never in my heart. Never did I viscerally fear for my safety or my daughter's safety until all of that happened, until the hate started pouring out of the cracks in the country from who knows where. But I think that it's so, there's such a sort of root cause of fear of the unknown. And so I think that the antidote to that is learning. It's understanding the history of everything that happened from the first time the slaves set foot on our land and were sold, to the Civil War, to the post-Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the failure of Reconstruction, black codes, Jim Crow laws, and the incredible similarities that we have in our country today to what happened then. It is still with us. And it was not until I started to trace that history is when I started to understand what systemic racism is. It is the system, our institutions, our government, our whole way of being, our business, our industry. It is all based on the white way of thinking, white supremacy. And so when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about the Ku Klux Klan. We are talking about the very systems that all of us are so ingrained in how we live our lives and how we do our things, how we think about the things that are in our world that we think about, and we don't think about what is in the world of the black community as they go through life. What do they face as they go through life? And so what I hope we all want to do is to learn more and to be more steeped in our learning.
Can I say one more thing in 20 words or less? I ran across a quote, I think it was from James Baldwin, and it said, "You cannot fix what you do not face. At Fourth Church, we're facing it.
I just want to thank you all for sharing with us your experiences from this trip and what you learned, and not at least also your feelings, what you felt, which is how we can more readily understand what the history of what you described to us. But also what impressed me was that you got a taste of how it feels like your very being is a target without you having anything, you have done without you having created anything that would be the cause for you being a target. And this is what was described as for the Jews during the Second World War. It's the same thing. In fact, Hitler learned from the American history. And I want to thank you all for coming. And next month, we have, our program is our work with the young adults, talking about how they experience Chicago and their work. So, and Joe is one who is, he's not organizing this event, I think. Right. They will be organizing it, but he's in charge of the 20s and 30s. So we'll meet them and they will share with us.
Some really great folks.
Yeah.